You're looking at Nikola Gardovic. He's the father of the groom. His son Milan is getting married today, and Nikola couldn't be more proud. Their small apartment in Sarajevo is packed with friends and family, all ready to celebrate the newlyweds. It's a day of joy, probably the happiest day of Nikola's life. But in less than 3 hours, Nikola will be dead, and his death will be the spark that ignites one of the most brutal conflicts in modern European history. A nation on the brink. To understand what happened that day, we need to understand where Bosnia was in the early 1990s. Yugoslavia was a country made up of several different ethnic groups living together. Serbs, Croats, Slovens, Bosniaks, who are Bosnian Muslims, Albanians, and many others. For decades, these groups had lived side by side. They were neighbors. They were friends. They intermarried. In cities like Sarajevo, it wasn't uncommon to find Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks living on the same street, their children playing together. But by the early 1990s, Yugoslavia was falling apart. Years of economic problems had taken their toll. Corruption was everywhere. Inflation was out of control. Prices were rising so fast that money became almost worthless. Unemployment was climbing. People were angry and desperate. And into this chaos came rising nationalism. Politicians began appealing to ethnic identity rather than unity. They began pointing fingers at other groups, blaming them for the country's problems. Old grievances from World War II and even earlier were dragged back into the light. Tensions between the many ethnic groups were rising fast. And then, less than a year before Nikola's son's wedding, something happened that changed everything. Serbian President Slobodan Milošević took control of the Yugoslav People's Army, the shared military that was supposed to protect all of Yugoslavia. With the army under his command, Milošević was now the most powerful man in the country, and he had a vision for the future, a dangerous vision, the rise of Milošević. Slobodan Milošević wasn't just any politician. He was a shrewd, calculating leader who understood how to use nationalism to gain power. Publicly, he began talking about a new idea, uniting all Serbs into one giant state, a greater Serbia. But here's the problem. Serbs lived all across Yugoslavia. In Serbia, yes, but also in Croatia, in Bosnia, in other republics. And Milošević's vision for a greater Serbia didn't include the other ethnic groups. No Croats, no Albanians, no Bosniaks. To most people who were paying attention, this sounded like ethnic cleansing, the forced removal of entire populations based on their ethnicity. For Bosnia's president, Alija Izetbegović, the writing was on the wall. If Bosnia stayed in Yugoslavia, Milošević would eventually come for them. The Bosniaks, who made up the largest single ethnic group in Bosnia, would be in danger. So Izetbegović made a decision. Bosnia would leave Yugoslavia. He called for a referendum, a vote on independence. And, as expected, his Bosnian Serb colleagues were far from pleased. A threat in parliament. This is Radovan Karadzic. He was the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, the Serbian population living inside Bosnia. Karadzic was a psychiatrist by training, a poet, and a politician. He was also a nationalist who believed Bosnia should remain part of a Serbian-dominated state. When Izetbegović announced the independence referendum, Karadzic stood up in parliament with a message, a warning, a threat. Speaking directly to the Bosniak members of parliament, Karadzic said that if Bosnia declared independence, it would lead to the disappearance of the Bosniak people. He openly threatened the president and the Bosniak population. It was an extraordinary moment. A political leader openly threatening ethnic violence in parliament. But despite the public threats from his Serbian rival, Izetbegović was convinced that Karadzic was bluffing. He believed it was just political theater, intimidation tactics, nothing more. And for a moment, it looked like he was right. On the day of the referendum in early 1992, nothing violent happened. The Bosnian Serbs boycotted the vote, which was expected, and with the Bosniaks and Croats voting together, they had the majority. The result was clear. Bosnia would become independent. Izetbegović had won the vote, but he was about to lose much, much more. The wedding day. Back at the wedding of Nicola's son, Milan, and his bride Diana, no one was thinking about the risk of civil war. This was a day for celebration, a day for family, a day for hope and new beginnings. With the ceremony over, the wedding guests climbed into their cars and drove to Sarajevo's old part of town for the reception. This was a Serbian wedding, and like many weddings, it was a loud, joyful affair. The convoy of cars drove through the streets waving Serbian flags from the windows. They honked their horns. They sang songs. People leaned out of car windows, laughing and celebrating. It was a party on wheels. But by pure chance, terrible, tragic chance, the wedding convoy passed a known Bosniak gangster walking on the side of the street. When he saw the Serbian flags waving from the cars, he was furious. The flags, in that moment, felt like a provocation, a statement. And in a city where tensions were already at a breaking point, it was too much. The man disappeared for a moment, and then he returned to the street. This time, he had a gun, the first victim. What happened next was captured on the wedding video camera. The gunman entered the car park where the wedding guests had stopped. He raised his weapon and he fired. Nikola Gardovic was struck. He fell. Within minutes, he was dead. By all accounts, it was a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nikola wasn't a politician. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a nationalist leader. He was just a father celebrating his son's wedding. But in that moment, in that city, at that time, it didn't matter. To Serbian leaders, Nikola's death was proof that their communities were no longer safe. It was evidence of Bosniak aggression. It was justification for what they were about to do. To Bosniak officials, it was the reckless act of a single criminal, a gangster with a gun, nothing more. Both sides were already viewing the same event through completely different lenses. To make matters worse, the gunman, though quickly identified by witnesses, was not arrested immediately. This only added fuel to the fire. Serbian media ran with the story. Nikola Gardovic became a symbol, a martyr, proof that Serbs in Bosnia were under attack. That same evening, just hours after Nikola's death, armed Serbian militias loyal to Karadzic began to move, the city under siege. Within hours of the shooting, armed Serb militias threw up barricades and checkpoints across Sarajevo. They blocked roads. They set up armed positions. They stopped cars and checked identifications, looking for Bosniaks. The local police were completely powerless to stop them. Many of the police officers were Serbs themselves and refused to act against their own ethnic group. Others were simply outnumbered and outgunned. Within hours, the capital city of Sarajevo was effectively under Serbian paramilitary control. The next day, Izetbegovic and Karadzic met face-to-face. The goal was to calm things down, to bring an end to the tension before it escalated any further, to pull back from the brink. But what Izetbegovic didn't know was that Karadzic had already been given backing from Milosevic in Serbia. The plan to partition Bosnia, to divide it along ethnic lines, had already been agreed upon in secret meetings, and Milosevic was about to make his move, the buildup of forces. In secret, Milosevic began transferring Bosnian Serb soldiers from the Yugoslav People's Army directly into Karadzic's forces. These weren't just local militias anymore. These were trained soldiers with military equipment, tanks, artillery, heavy weapons. Overnight, Karadzic's force went from a few scattered militias, maybe a few thousand men, to more than 80,000 well-armed troops. It was an army, a real army. On top of that, Milosevic also sent in his paramilitary units. These were some of Serbia's most hardcore ultranationalists, groups with names like the White Eagles, the Serbian Volunteer Guard, and Arkan's Tigers. These men weren't regular soldiers. They were extremists, volunteers who believed in the cause of a greater Serbia with an almost religious fervor. And they had been given one order: to remove anyone who wasn't Serbian from Bosnian territory, by any means necessary. The first attack, Bijeljina. Their first target was the city of Bijeljina in northeastern Bosnia. This happened in early April of 1992, just weeks after the independence referendum. Bijeljina was a mixed city. Serbs lived there, yes, but so did Bosniaks. They had lived together for generations, but that was about to end. It took the heavily armed Serbian forces just 3 days to capture the city. The fighting was brutal but one-sided. The Bosniak residents had no military force to defend themselves, no weapons, no organization. They were civilians. On the final day of the attack, Serbian soldiers began tracking down and rounding up anyone they identified as Bosniak. They also targeted known supporters of Izetbegovic and the independence movement. These people, men mostly, but some women too, were lined up on the sides of streets, in the town square, in front of their own homes, and then they were executed, shot one by one. The bodies were left in the streets as a message, as a warning. The ethnic cleansing of Bosnia had begun. The peace march. Back in Sarajevo, people were desperate to stop the violence before it spread. Tens of thousands of people, Bosniaks, Croats, and even many Serbs, they came together, marching for peace, holding signs, chanting for unity. It was a remarkable sight. In the face of rising nationalism and violence, ordinary people were saying, "We don't want this. We want to live together." But then, some of the demonstrators made a decision. They decided to march toward Karadzic's party headquarters, which was located in the Holiday Inn hotel. They wanted to confront him directly, to demand that he stop the violence. What they didn't know was that Karadzic had placed snipers on top of several buildings around the hotel. As the crowd approached the hotel and attempted to push into the lobby, the snipers opened fire. Shots rang out across the square. People screamed, they ran, they scattered. 6 people died that day. Many more were wounded. The peace march had ended in bloodshed, the spread of violence. Across eastern Bosnia, Karadzic's units began moving into towns and villages with largely Bosniak populations. What happened next followed a horrifying pattern that would be repeated dozens of times over the coming months. First, Serbian forces would surround a town. They would cut off the roads. No one could get in or out. Then they would enter the town and begin separating people by ethnicity. Serbs were told to stay in their homes or were given armbands to identify themselves. Bosniaks and Croats were not so lucky. Civilians were dragged from their homes, pulled out into the streets, beaten in front of their families. Men of military age, which could mean anyone from 16 to 60, were taken away at gunpoint, loaded onto buses or trucks, driven to detention camps or execution sites. Women, children, and elderly people were told to leave, to abandon their homes, their possessions, everything they owned. They were given hours, sometimes just minutes, to pack what they could carry and go. In the town of Zvornik alone, around 2,000 people vanished in just a few days. Any remaining survivors were forced to leave the city under armed escort. They were put on buses and driven to the border with Bosniak-controlled territory and told never to return. A week before the Serbian forces arrived, 49,000 Bosniaks lived in Zvornik. Now, not a single one remained. 5 centuries of Islamic life and culture in that city. Mosques, schools, graveyards, entire neighborhoods had been wiped out. And this was just one town, the siege of Sarajevo. It didn't take long before Karadzic's Bosnian Serb forces controlled roughly 3/4 of Bosnia. Towns and cities fell one after another. The Bosnian government forces were completely outmatched. They had almost no heavy weapons, no air force, and limited ammunition. And so, the Serbian forces turned their attention to their final target, Sarajevo, the capital, the heart of Bosnia, the city where this all began. But Sarajevo would not fall easily. It was a large city, over 400,000 people, and it was defended by what remained of the Bosnian government forces. So, Karadzic decided on a different strategy. If he couldn't take the city by force, he would destroy it from a distance. Serbian forces moved into the hills and mountains surrounding Sarajevo. They brought artillery, they brought mortars, they brought tanks, and then they began to fire. For the next 4 years, nearly 1,400 days, Karadzic's forces would bomb Sarajevo every single day. They hit homes, they hit hospitals, they hit schools, they hit markets where people were trying to buy food. They hit funeral processions. They hit children playing in the streets. The snipers positioned in the hills would shoot at anyone who moved. People couldn't walk to work, couldn't go to school, couldn't even cross the street without risking their lives. The term Sniper Alley was coined to describe the main boulevard through the city. Drivers would speed through at full speed, swerving wildly, hoping not to get hit. Food ran out within months. Water supplies were cut. Electricity was gone. In winter, people burned furniture and books just to stay warm. Sarajevo, a modern European capital city, became a war zone, a place where survival was a daily struggle. Over 11,000 people would die in the siege of Sarajevo alone. More than 1,500 of them were children. The Srebrenica massacre. But the worst was yet to come. In July of 1995, Serbian forces attacked the town of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia. This town had been declared a safe area by the United Nations. UN peacekeepers were stationed there to protect the civilians who had fled there for safety. But when the Serbian forces arrived, the UN peacekeepers stood aside. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and they made the decision not to fight. What happened next was the worst atrocity in Europe since World War II. Serbian forces, under the command of General Ratko Mladic, separated the men and boys from the women and children. Over the course of several days, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were systematically executed. They were taken to fields, to warehouses, to forests, lined up and shot. Mass graves were dug to hide the evidence. Later, when investigators began to close in, the bodies were dug up again and moved to secondary grave sites to make them harder to find. It was genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy the Bosniak population, the end of the war. The war finally began to turn in late 1995. After years of avoiding direct intervention, NATO, led by the United States, launched a massive bombing campaign against Serbian positions. The airstrikes were devastating. Serbian artillery positions, command centers, and military infrastructure were destroyed. Milosevic, facing international pressure and the collapse of his military positions, finally agreed to negotiate. In November 1995, the Dayton Agreement was signed in Dayton, Ohio. The war was over, but peace came at a price. The price of peace. For President Izetbegovic, the peace deal was bittersweet. In an effort to end the war quickly, the United States focused on securing peace at any cost. Bosnia's government was exhausted, surrounded, running out of ammunition and options. It was decided that the burden of compromise would fall on them. The result was a peace deal that left nearly half the country under Bosnian Serb control. Bosnia was divided into two entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, the Bosnian Serb Republic. It was a state divided within itself. In total, over 100,000 people had died in the war. More than 2 million people, nearly half the population, had been displaced from their homes. Justice and aftermath. After the war, international tribunals were established to prosecute those responsible for war crimes. Radovan Karadzic, the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, went into hiding. He lived undercover for more than a decade, working as an alternative medicine practitioner in Belgrade under a false name. He was finally arrested in 2008. He was charged with genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. In 2016, he was found guilty on nearly all counts. he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Later, this was increased to life imprisonment. Slobodan Milošević was arrested in 2001 and sent to The Hague to stand trial. He was charged with genocide and crimes against humanity. But Milošević never saw the end of his trial. In 2006, he died of a heart attack in his cell. General Ratko Mladić, the commander responsible for the Srebrenica massacre, was arrested in 2011. He was convicted of genocide and sentenced to life in prison. The legacy. More than 30 years after the war ended, Bosnia is still a divided country. Many Bosniak and Croat families still haven't returned to the homes that were taken from them during the war. Entire towns remain ethnically separated. Thousands of people who survived extreme human rights abuses are still waiting for justice, for acknowledgement, for apology. But with the international trials mostly over, and leaders in Bosnia's Serb-controlled region denying that many of the crimes ever took place, the chances of full reconciliation seem almost zero. The scars of the war run deep, and they haven't healed. The gunman. As for the man who shot Nikola Gardovic at his son's wedding, the spark that started it all, his fate came years later. In 2007, on his way to morning prayers, he was shot and killed outside his apartment in Sarajevo. His killer was never found. Some say it was revenge, others say it was unrelated. But in a country still haunted by the ghosts of war, it's hard to know for certain. What is certain is that Nikola Gardovic's death became a symbol of how quickly peace can collapse. How a single act of violence, in the right conditions, can spiral into catastrophe. A wedding day that should have been filled with joy became the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in modern European history. Closing. The Bosnian War is a reminder of how fragile peace can be. How quickly neighbors can become enemies when politicians exploit fear and hatred. It's a reminder of the importance of international intervention when genocide begins, and a reminder of how difficult it is to rebuild trust once it's been shattered. Today, Bosnia exists in an uneasy peace. The wounds are still fresh, the divisions still deep. But the story deserves to be told, the victims deserve to be remembered, and the lessons deserve to be learned. Because if we forget what happened in Bosnia, we risk letting it happen again. Thanks for watching this difficult but important look at the Bosnian War and genocide. If you found this video meaningful, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps us continue bringing you these critical stories from history. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. And please, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or any connections you might have to this story. Once again, thank you for giving your time to learn about this tragic chapter of history. We'll see you in the next one.